In our last sort of 15 minutes, I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask questions of the speakers. So I'll ask this afternoon's speakers to please come up and sit.
Chair, and I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions. And one thing that keeps bothering me is, why did we have such a positive international report, and then we hear anecdotal evidence and post-analysis evidence about impending catastrophe or actual events on the ground that belie such a positive report? This one question. Second, we all know about donor fatigue. So instead of pledging sums of money, why can't we start the program and have people pledge a project? Because we know cost of materials and cost of design are going to go up. And so someone feels very good, they give $1 million or 20 million or $1 billion, but the ongoing need continues. So if we can organize this, that these donor countries pledge themselves to an accomplishment of a project. And I'd like to have the panel respond.
Who'd like to begin? Maybe Dr. Zamostian.
Well, if I understand correctly, you refer to the Chernobyl Forum report, the promising project, yeah? The report, yeah? What? Sorry? Well, again, I would like to point out that the report was commissioned by 8 United Nations agencies and not only by EIA. It's not, the EIA was responsible for support of expert group working on environmental consequences of the accident. And most of criticism today and during the recent conferences were about the health consequences. And this is the WHO who supported the health expert group, consisted from prominent scientists. And what they did is they actually reevaluated the findings of more of the previous report by UNSCARE, and particularly the Annex J devoted to Chernobyl accident consequences. And they just reconfirm findings of this Annex J report. Well, although there are still, as I mentioned earlier today, there are still ongoing disputes. And this, from a scientific point of view, is absolutely a normal situation. But in any case, at some point of time, the scientific community will have to come up with a consensus opinion on health impact of Chernobyl, and as particular, and the overall consequences of Chernobyl accident as radiological and non-radiological factors as a whole.
And the second question about funding specific projects.
I think any time that we organize a campaign, it's always focused on a specific project, so that whether it's surgical equipment or a laparoscopy machine or a blood gas analyzer, such as has been purchased from the Chicago community, it's always focused on a specific target. So that, but on the other hand, I think we all have to realize that medical technology tends to be pretty expensive. Our gals back in New Jersey and in Kiev do, I think, an outstanding job of trying to leverage whatever funds we receive to try to get additional piece of equipment for free or at half price, or to get outright donations of certain types of commodities. But at the end of the day, in order to do an integrated program and to develop an integrated hospital partnership, and I think this would be a wonderful way to do it for Chicago to select, let it be a hospital in Kyiv or Ivano-Frankivsk or in Zhytomyr, to say that's the place we're going to focus our efforts on and to pour resources into that place so you can really have a long-term relationship with that community. So that's, I think that would be the best approach, is to focus on one location. So that, I totally endorse your recommendation.
No, but I was referring, excuse me, but I was also referring to the Chernobyl situation where we've committed a certain amount of funds, but it seems that the estimates and the cost of materials are going to exceed that by a substantial amount. So because of donor fatigue, would it be more convenient to pitch this project, quote unquote, as a project? And so people commit as countries to carry on until the work is finished, because if you commit just a certain amount of resource and say, well, I've given my 10 million or 20 million, and the project is in cost overrun, that's much more difficult to overcome than, let's say, that a group of countries commit to do a certain mechanical, quote unquote, project. And so then they will continue to fund it, and we will not enter into the donor fatigue. Thank you.
I take it that was directed more at my area, and in terms of the shelter fund. It is frustrating because you never know how much a project is going to cost until you're done with it. And that's why the cost increases there in some regards are virtual, because once the design was in place, you could actually cost it out according to any kind of a major construction project. And you add in things like risk and escalation of materials, cost increases in materials. So under the best of circumstances, that may not be the final cost. It may come in lower. In reality, rarely, it's a rare find on a project of this scale, lasting this long, that in all likelihood, it won't come in lower. And you can believe this is a constant source of tension amongst the international community. There was only supposed to be 2 donor events. You saw listed a third. So, I mean, yes, there's donor fatigue, but at the same time, there is donor commitment to not see this project fail. And I would point out that, for instance, during the 3rd round of pledging, the U.S. came up with $45 million. Ukraine came up with a substantial pledge as well, in addition, as well as just, you see, Russia now has joined with $10 million. And the sentiment is that it's not over till it's over. And I didn't want to leave the impression that, the international community is going to walk away. But at the same time, the U.S. government can only commit funds that are approved by its Congress. And so you're very much restricted in terms of, you have to have a funding mechanism like the Freedom to Report Act, which in fact is now kind of in its sunset. It was only intended to last for a certain period of time. So you have all these factors coming together. And I hear what you're saying. The problem with this project is it is so large, drawn out, one of a kind. And again, it's being funded internationally, but it's being conducted in Ukraine. And to a large extent, the success or failure of the project rests on Ukraine itself in terms of having a workforce, ensuring that approvals are forthcoming within a certain time frame. The delays just add to the cost. I think the estimate is about $15 million per month of delays for delay costs. So it's not a simple problem. And I think if it were a smaller project, for instance, I'll just give one example. The shutdown of Unit 3 meant that there would be no more hot water or heating for the whole facility. You can't, and everyone understands that Ukraine is very cold in the winter. That would involve freezing of the the fuel in the reactors, the fuel pool, which is not a condition you can allow. So the U.S. Department of Energy went in bilaterally on its own, and for approximately $30 million, built a heat plant that now powers or provides heat for that facility. So there's a case where, you know, a country said, this needs to be done, it needs to be done rapidly, and no messing around, and it got done. So it can happen, but again, this is such a large project, but I feel your frustration.
Because one of the questions was devoted to health consequences, and the question was about why Forum basically decided that there are no health consequences except thyroid cancer. What I would like to tell you that the person, a physician who is a radiobiologist, definitely know that the latency period for the solid cancers is much more than 15 years, including radiation-induced cancer. And in Chernobyl accident, after the Chernobyl accident, we expected only a very small latency period for thyroid cancer and leukemia. That means that the whole literature that was analyzed basically was based on data, I believe, prior to some period of time. That means that we could expect increase, but this increase would be visible only after some period of time. That means that we don't have contradiction. And even Dr. Okeanov's report was telling that they started to see some increase of risk of solid tumors only in year 2002, 2003. That means that in the future, we have to very carefully analyze this data, but it's too soon to make conclusions on this type of outcomes. Thank you.
Dr. Procek?
George Prosek. My question is concerning food and nutrition. I'm not sure who to direct this to. Mercury levels here in America have been looked at, and we've been told to avoid fish. Now, in Ukraine, there's considerable radioactivity from the Chornobyl region, and I think it sounds like this has been ignored as a chronic problem in that you have places such as Kyiv that where the water supply leaches into Kyiv, the food is consumed by people in Kyiv. In other areas in the country, food may be produced in this area, and I'm sure the food is not labeled as to where it comes from. Everyone laughs at this, but let's say you do get mushrooms from some parts of Ukraine, and then you give it to your children here in America. I think you should be concerned. Could somebody comment on this, please?
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting question. In fact, one of the most important source of incomes for local communities in the northern part of Zhytomyr and Rivne Oblast, and as well as in Volyn, is a collection of berries and mushrooms from forest and selling to the, let's say, companies or businessmen who are taking these mushrooms most probably outside Ukraine after some kind of pre-treatment. It's actually a monkey business. I mean, it's a legal business. It's not official business. However, everybody know that this business exists, and people could get at least some income to survive from this kind of activities. Well, at the same time, I don't think that the European Union system of control will allow to bring these products through some illegal chains, at least in a big amount of, of these products. So, from one point of view, this is really a critical issue to be addressed in Ukraine. How to, if this demand or let's say profit-gaining activity exists, it should be legalized and a proper control should be established. From another point of view, I don't think that there is a really need to be concerned about the possibility to consume mushrooms from Ukraine in the United States. If I answer your question.
No, I'd like to ask about people live in Kyiv,
And
and they
Kyiv-
have a water supply that drains down from,
okay.
what would they do about the water? Do they check with a Geiger counter?
No. Well, with the Geiger counter, you can't actually effectively measure the radioactivity of drinking water unless this is a water from reactor. For these purposes, there are more sophisticated measurement techniques. Well, to be short, I would say that the drinking water quality in Kyiv requires more attention from its chemical and microbiological quality rather than its radiological quality. It's being controlled quite strictly. The part of the supply is from underground water, artesian water. But as a public health professional, probably, I would encourage people to use the bottled water instead of tap water, not because of radiation, but because of chemical pollution and microbiological quality. In terms of consumption of fish and forest products, unless you buying it on the street markets, you can find it, these street markets almost everywhere in Kyiv, you can be pretty sure that the quality of foodstuffs are satisfying the standards. If you're going to the forest or buying this foodstuff from the street market, it's on your own risk, as everywhere and in every country.
And if I could just add about the water quality problem, because that's obviously a big concern. As it turns out, the radioactivity that entered the water, the streams and the rivers had to go somewhere. It hasn't just disappeared, but my understanding is largely that was has been partitioned into the sediments. And so now that doesn't mean that it's not a problem, but in terms of nature taking care of an issue, it turns out that the cesium, et cetera, you can find it in the sediments. And so I know that's not an ideal solution, but in terms of actually what's in the water column, what's actually dissolved in solution, the water quality is relatively, if you want to use the word safe, from the standpoint of radiological health concerns. But that doesn't mean if there's a change that shouldn't be monitored. And my understanding is it is monitored, but...
In the sediment of the Dnipro?
Yes.
If I could just add a little something to that, I think the risk, I would agree that I think the risk of significant contamination of the water, although I tend not to drink tap water anyway, and I think there's any number of other pollutants and toxins that are problematic. Our biggest concern is really for the people that live in those areas that are contaminated by quote-unquote low levels of radiation, but they are at risk for accumulating over time significant amounts of radionuclides in their system through the consumption of meats from wild animals or żurawlina from berries, from mushrooms, etc. And there is, unfortunately, there is evidence that the food chain is already suffering from substantial contamination. For instance, I know that in the research that was done under the supervision of Bristol University in Britain, working with our colleagues at the Institute of Pediatrics and Obstetrics and Gynecology, significant levels of radioactive cesium in placentas, significant levels of radioactive cesium and strontium in women's breast milk. Also interesting that because some of these elements tend to mimic natural elements that are necessary for the human body. For instance, strontium is a very aggressive replacement or mimicker of calcium. It does tend to concentrate, and there needs to be very, very strict control of milk and dairy products that are consumed by those children living in those areas. For instance, even as far away as Ireland and England, there are still farms to this day that are not allowed to sell. They're under very, very strict controls for dairy products going out there. And one other very disturbing piece of information that we received from a study that, again, it's not yet been published. We're looking for more information on this, but a large number of children in a study group in Kyiv province who were either from Kyiv province, who were living in contaminated villages, tend to suffer from osteomalacia, osteofibrosis, illnesses that normally would not be occurring except in very elderly people, and they're appearing already in young children. And also there was in stillborn fetuses, there was research on some of the radionuclides that seem to be streaming down into both the unborn fetus and into pregnant moms. So these are areas that really need to be very, very carefully monitored, but primarily in those areas that have large numbers of people living and consuming small quantities of these radionuclides, but over a long period of time where a cumulative dose can concentrate in the bladder, in the intestine, and lead to problems down the road.
Vasily Lunchina from Chicago. I have a comment and a few questions. And the comment has to do with the participation of the Russian Federation in financing the SIP, their 10 million entry. It seems to me that with Putin being the leader of the G8 now, he has a chance to step up to the plate in Leningrad and donate a substantially greater amount of money for this project, taking into account that, in fact, this is a Russian nuclear reactor that they built, and they're really responsible for the tragedy that happened there. So he has an opportunity to help out. Now my question is to Mr. and Mrs. Khan about the structure itself. The first question is, as you built the structure and you advance it over the reactor, are you afraid that you might not be able to shift it so that it goes into place as it grows bigger and bigger? In other words, that you won't be able, because you're shifting that whole structure over the reactor. Is there ever a time when the weight of the structure is so great that you can't budge it? And number two question is whether you indeed have to dismantle the sarcophagus, and are you worried that while you're dismantling the sarcophagus that it implodes on itself at that time?
I guess the brief answer is no. We're not worried that the structure will be too heavy to slide. That's part of the design, and as the video mentioned, it's moving on Teflon bearings, and this is a technology that's used in a lot of places, and it's pretty well tested. The other question was, are we concerned that the shelter is going to implode once deconstruction begins? And again, that's a concern, that there's going to be some type of collapse of some of the structures. But it's hard to really say. I guess the answer is no. We're not worried at this time. It's a bridge that's going to need to be crossed when the deconstruction begins.
But just to add, if we can, with the design for the new safe confinement, the conceptual design has been completed, and they're about to award the contract for the detailed design and construction of the facility. So the decisions, the final decisions of how everything's going to work will be that of the contractor who will win this contract.
But I would also add that I think once you start deconstructing the existing sarcophagus, any weight that you can remove from the structure as you go along will hopefully, I would hope, decrease the probability of collapse. I mean, because that's, I think, ultimately what you're worried about is the weight of all those components that were just stacked on top of one another onto uncertain structures. So I think once you get to the point where you have those cranes in place and are deconstructing, I think hopefully the worst is over. It's the concern until you get something in place that I think that worries the government of Ukraine and the international community the most.
I'm Bowden Jodick, professor of biology at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. My question is something of an extrapolation from the last discussion. When the shelter implementation plan is finally approved and put in place, will local Ukrainian labor from the Kiev area on up to Chornobyl be able to do some or much of the work? Will they be employed in that project? And secondly, is there some type of Yucca Mountain facility, as is proposed in this country, for a lot of spent nuclear fuel to place this tremendous amount of this 97% of the material that still remains in reactor number 4, where it'll be buried ostensibly for a very long period of time before it becomes safe, the half-life and so forth issue?
Well, the labor issue is actually a major concern, and the intention is to basically employ as many Ukrainians as possible, because one, that's the cheapest way to get the work done, is to have the qualified workforce there in Ukraine. One of the problems, of course, and I think it was alluded to earlier, was a lot of the, for instance, the technical people left the plant upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, and so you had a mass exodus of a lot of the skilled labor during that period. And in general, there's been a challenge about getting enough qualified and healthy workers, because superimposed on top of all of this, of course, is you have the health concerns, whatever the source, whether it be social and diet and exercise and other, and also other health impacts associated with the accident itself. You have all that overlaid with the other challenges. So that is a major concern, and it's something that's going to have to be worked out by the government. That's one of the factors.
And I might also add another pressure on the worker population is the high expected turnover of the workers when some of them get their maximum annual dose and have to be shifted out, requiring other workers to come in.
And what was the second part of your question?
The ultimate repository for the hot material is still inside the reactor.
Well, that's a challenge for all governments on the planet, including the U.S. We cite the first geologic repository, the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico was probably the first. I believe the government of Ukraine is looking at the issue, but again, as with any country, it's going to be a challenging one. The one thing about the exclusion zone is, I think, the one use that has been foreseen for some of it as the most contaminated areas is to make it a logical place for repositories. But again, that's a challenging issue in and of itself, with or without Chernobyl on top of everything else. So it's a good question. It's something that's needed, obviously, is you need a place to put the waste. But again, the United States is struggling with this issue, as is every other country in the world.
If I can add something to that. Yes, the Ukrainians are aware that they are going to have to deal with long-term waste, not just from Chernobyl, but from their other reactors as well. And like many other countries, they also have a long-term plan to build more reactors. This is a global matter. This is not just Ukraine. It's going on in this country. It's going on in Sweden. It's going on in Russia. It's going on in China, India. For a number of reasons, there are going to be a lot more reactors built. There's therefore going to be a lot more spent fuel to be dealt with. And right at the moment, each nation has to handle its own spent fuel. Now, the Department of Energy has a plan that they're trying to sell to the international community, which would help ameliorate that for a number of which would be sort of using other technologies, and I don't want to get into that right now, because it's hugely long-term. But in our lifetime, and probably our children's lifetimes, each country's got to deal with its own spent fuel. Now, I know the Ukrainians are trying to use other countries' experience, including ours, on how you go about evaluating sites in your country. Ukraine's going to undertake those kinds of studies. They also are going to build a interim spent fuel storage facility on the surface until they understand how they're going to deal with the long-term final repository. They have thoughts about putting such a repository on the Chernobyl site. So one would think, and I'm just speculating here, one would think that they would integrate the Chernobyl waste issue with the spent fuel issues that are going to be, well, the spent fuel that will have to come from other sites throughout Ukraine.
I just wanted to add a little something to that. Having lived in Ukraine for the last year and listened to some of the debate that's going on about this is actually kind of interesting because last fall, President Yushchenko floated this trial balloon about maybe it wouldn't be, he actually visited the Chernobyl site and said, you know, it might not be a bad idea to actually site an international nuclear waste facility here. Well, as you might imagine, that elicited a blistering response from the environmental community. He quickly withdrew that proposal. But there are very, very serious issues, and I agree with Gordon on this, and with Andrew, that there are very, very serious issues involved in this, and the fundamental issue has to be geologic appropriateness of that site. What a lot of Ukrainians are concerned about is they don't want an unsavory quid pro quo where behind the scenes there's a deal struck. And again, I'm just communicating what some of the debate and anxiety is on the street in Ukraine. They're basically saying, look, if Chernobyl is a geologically appropriate site to put a long-term waste dump, and that's confirmed by international authorities, that's one thing. What we don't want to do, first of all, people are very skeptical of it because they're, again, looking at the Polesian marshes. They're saying, how can a marsh, you know, conceptually it's very difficult to conceive of how, you know, whether that's an appropriate place to put, you know, peat bog to put, you know, a long-term waste site. And the other thing is they do not want a quid pro quo where basically there's a deal struck where people say, well, you know, you can enter into we might accelerate your accession to the European Union and NATO and all this kind of stuff, but man, we really have this problem with long-term storage of nuclear waste, and you guys could really help us out. And what's the big deal? You already have all of this nuclear waste sitting in Chernobyl. What's a little extra waste coming from beyond the borders? So these are very ticklish issues. The Swedes, I understand, have done a very good job of creating long-term waste repositories in, I believe, in cliffs, actually, in their fjords that have been quite effective and it's very stable. I don't know that Ukraine's got something along those lines that there may be in other oblasts, but maybe not in Chernobyl. So this is going to be, this is really worth watching to see how this debate unfolds.
Well, I know something about Sweden and Finland as well. They have the benefit of having very deep, hard granite. And so they also have small, homogeneous countries in which they can bring a consensus of approval, if you will, to the situation, which we don't have in this country, for sure, and it'll be difficult there. But I do not believe that there's going to be any surreptitious, siting in Ukraine or anywhere else simply because it's such a global issue. Now, one thing people haven't mentioned is Russia. You know, Russia's thinking about taking other people's spent fuel. Now, there's all sorts of political ramifications of that, which we can get into over a beer, but not here. But that's a long-term issue. It's what to do with the ultimate disposition of spent fuel everywhere in the world, including in this country. Yucca Mountain is is no further along now than it was 20 years ago. And so there are other solutions that are being considered that are not, let's say, traditionally what we've been thinking about for the last 20 years.
Okay, if there are no other questions, then on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to thank all of our speakers who traveled here literally from around the world to share their knowledge and expertise with us. Thank you very much. Also, I'd like to again thank our donors, Selfreliance and the Heritage Foundation, and also remind everyone that Ukrainian National Museum has an exhibit on Chernobyl that if you haven't visited, I strongly encourage you to visit. And there is a memorial mass tomorrow at St. Nicholas Cathedral for the victims of Chernobyl. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you who participated in the conference today. Your participation does make a difference, and hopefully the knowledge that you've gained here, as Alex Kuzma said, will serve as a catalyst for action. Thank you, and good night.